Death on the battlefield. The Black Death, one of the most devastating plagues in human history. In the year 1346, Europe was about to face an adversary unlike any other. Emerging from Asia, it first made landfall in the Sicilian port of Messina. From there, it spread like wildfire, consuming all in its path. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, was carried by these tiny assassins called fleas, residing on rats that were traveling along trade routes. These fleas acted as biological time bombs, infecting humans with the bacteria Yersinia pestis. As the plague progressed, entire families would succumb to its relentless grip, leaving behind haunting scenes of homes abandoned in the middle of the day. The horrifying symptoms included fever, chills, headaches, and agonizing swellings in the groin and armpits, which when opened, rather than yielding pus or blood, released nothing. Victims were gripped by a profound weakness that rapidly led to delirious hallucinations. The Black Death did not discriminate. Social class was no shield against its fury. Doctors, despite their best efforts, were powerless in the face of this invisible enemy. The air grew thick with the stench of death as the plague swept through towns, cities, and eventually the countryside, claiming victims at an astonishing rate. By the time it ebbed, approximately 30 to 50 million people were dead, leaving a scar across Europe that would never truly heal. The impact went beyond lives lost. The labor shortage resulting from the plague had far-reaching consequences, contributing to the decline of feudalism and marking a significant shift in European history. The Battle of Crusades, the bloodiest day in Hungarian history. On August 11, 1526, history bore witness to one of the most brutal and decisive battles in medieval Europe. The Battle of Crusades, also known as the Battle of Mohacs. This clash of arms between the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary was more than just a military engagement. It was a turning point that reshaped the political landscape of the continent. The Ottoman army, a formidable force under the command of the renowned Sultan Solomon the Magnificent, had set its sights on expanding its dominion into Central Europe. The Hungarians, though outnumbered, were determined to resist this incursion. What ensued was a confrontation that has echoed through the annals of history. The Ottoman forces, comprising a multitude of ethnicities and boasting an estimated strength of between 80,000 and 120,000 soldiers, advanced into Hungary. Despite being outnumbered, Louis II of Hungary and his army of around 25,000 men took up arms to defend their homeland. The battle commenced with a cavalry charge by the Ottoman light troops. Though initially successful, the Hungarians regrouped and launched a counterattack. However, the tide of the battle turned when Louis II was killed, his head severed from his body by an Ottoman scimitar. With their king slain and their morale shattered, the Hungarians were routed, suffering catastrophic losses. The Ottoman victory was resounding, establishing their supremacy in the region. The immediate aftermath saw the Ottomans seize control of Hungary's southern territories, including Belgrade, Bosnia, Serbia, and Transylvania. The long-term implications were equally significant. The Battle of Crusades marked a pivotal moment in the Ottoman-Hungarian conflicts, setting the stage for centuries of struggles over control in Central and Eastern Europe. The staggering casualty figures serve as a grim reminder of the brutality and impact of this historic event. Estimates place the total number of deaths between 10,000 and 20,000 Hungarians, including nobility, soldiers, and civilians alike. It is important to note that these figures are approximations based on historical accounts, and estimations, as precise records from the period, are often incomplete or contradictory. The lack of comprehensive documentation is a common challenge when dealing with casualty figures from medieval battles. Primary sources such as chronicles or military reports may provide some details, but often they focus more on the overall account of the battle, rather than specific casualty numbers. Additionally, the definition of what constitutes a casualty can vary. Some sources may include only those killed in action, while others may incorporate deaths resulting from disease, starvation, or other factors in the aftermath of the battle. Furthermore, biases among historians and the use of exaggerated or propaganda-driven accounts can also influence the figures presented. Consequently, when exploring casualty figures from medieval battles, it's crucial to approach them with a critical eye, considering the limitations of the available historical records and the potential for bias or exaggeration. Historians continue to debate and refine these numbers, striving for a more accurate understanding of the true cost of this epic clash. The Mongol conquests, a trail of millions in blood. Genghis Khan and his Mongol successors changed the course of history by conquering vast swaths of land across Asia and Europe. Their expansionist campaigns resulted in a staggering loss of life. Historians estimate that the total number of fatalities caused by the Mongols during their conquests could be as high as 40 million, making it one of the deadliest periods in human history. Several factors contribute to the high death toll associated with the Mongol conquests. First and foremost, the sheer scale and brutality of their military campaigns were unprecedented. The Mongol armies, known for their ruthlessness and efficiency, employed advanced military tactics and weaponry, allowing them to swiftly overpower their enemies. They targeted not only opposing armies, but also civilian populations, pillaging villages and cities along their path. The Mongols' disregard for prisoners led to mass executions, further contributing to the staggering death toll. Additionally, the vastness of the Mongol Empire, which stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, meant that their conquests spanned across diverse regions and encompassed numerous ethnic groups and civilizations. This wide reach inevitably led to extensive bloodshed as the Mongols sought to subjugate and integrate these disparate populations into their empire. Moreover, the Mongol conquests coincided with a period of intense warfare and conflict in many parts of the world. As the Mongols expanded, they encountered various rival powers and kingdoms that were also engaged in their own struggles for dominance. This convergence of military campaigns resulted in a gruesome tapestry of battles and sieges that claimed countless lives. Despite the passage of time, the legacy of the Mongol conquests continues to evoke both fascination and horror. The staggering death toll serves as a grim reminder of the destructive power and relentless ambition of these nomadic warriors who left an indelible mark on the course of human history. The French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. The French Revolution, a pivotal moment in European history, brought about profound political and social changes in France and beyond. However, amidst the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, there existed a darker chapter, the Reign of Terror, a period of extreme violence and political turmoil that shook the nation from 1793 to 1794. During this tumultuous time, the revolutionary government, driven by a fanatical zeal to suppress internal opposition and external threats, employed increasingly radical measures to consolidate its power. The Committee of Public Safety, a central agency for enforcing revolutionary policies, took control of the nation and initiated a campaign of mass arrests and executions. Thousands of suspected enemies of the revolution, including members of the clergy, aristocracy, and intellectuals, were apprehended and charged with treason, conspiracy, or simply opposing the radicalism of the Jacobins, a powerful political faction. The trials were swift and the punishment severe. The guillotine, a device invented during the revolution to ensure swift and supposedly humane execution, became a prominent symbol of the Reign of Terror. An estimated 17,000 people were sent to the guillotine during this period, including Queen Marie Antoinette, King Louis XVI's wife, and hundreds of other aristocrats, politicians, and intellectuals. Beyond the immediate victims, the Reign of Terror cast a pall of fear and suspicion over France. Families were torn apart as accusations and denunciations became commonplace. The very fabric of society was disrupted as the revolutionary fervor knew no bounds. The brutality and excesses of the Reign of Terror ultimately contributed to its demise. By the end of 1794, as the revolutionary government overextended its authority and alienated potential allies, the more moderate elements of the political spectrum rallied to end the bloodshed. Maximilien Robespierre, the leader of the Jacobins and architect of the Reign of Terror, was arrested and guillotined, marking the beginning of the Thermidorian reaction, a period of political stability and moderation that followed the excesses of the revolution. The French Revolution and the ensuing Reign of Terror stand as a testament to the complexities and contradictions of revolutionary fervor. While the ideals of liberty and equality continue to resonate, the horrors of the Reign of Terror serve as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked extremism and the importance of balance in the pursuit of societal change. The 30 Years' War, a continental bloodbath. The 30 Years' War, a devastating conflict that ravaged Europe from 1618 to 1648, was a complex web of religious, political, and dynastic tensions that ultimately reshaped the continent. Originating in the Holy Roman Empire, the war involved a tangled web of alliances between various European powers. At its core, the conflict was rooted in the struggle between the forces of the Catholic Church and the rising Protestant movements. The Bohemian Revolt of 1618, sparked by dissatisfaction among Protestant nobles towards the Habsburg dynasty's efforts to reassert Catholic rule, is widely seen as the catalyst for the war. The ensuing decades witnessed a series of shifting alliances and brutal campaigns across Europe. One of the most infamous episodes was the Danish intervention in the war, which ended with the massacre of Christian IV's army at the Battle of Fehmarn. The Swedish intervention under Gustavus Adolphus is also remembered for its impact, including the Swedish victory at the Battle of Breitenfeld. Religious fervor and persecution also played a significant role in the war. The Edict of Restitution issued in 1629 aimed to restore Catholic dominance within the empire, and resulted in the confiscation of Protestant church property. The war's devastating toll on populations is exemplified by the Siege of Magdeburg in 1631, where over 20,000 civilians were killed. As the war dragged on, it gradually transformed into a broader struggle for power and territory. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ultimately brought an end to the conflict. The war's impact was profound. It significantly weakened the Holy Roman Empire, paved the way for the rise of France as a major European power, and established the principle of state sovereignty. The 30 Years' War stands as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked religious tensions and power struggles in shaping European history. These journeys through history reveal a sobering truth. Behind the tales of knights and castles, the medieval world was painted with the somber hues of death. Whether it was the devastation of the Black Death, the carnage of battles, the brutality of the French Revolution, or the continental bloodbath of the 30 Years' War, each episode serves as a chilling reminder of the fragility of life in bygone eras. Death was not a visitor in the medieval world, it was a permanent resident. Understanding these harrowing realities allows us to appreciate the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity and serves as a potent reminder of the importance of cherishing life in the present. As we continue to explore history, let us remember that every great story is accompanied by countless lives touched by death. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful young woman named Joan. She lived in a small village in France, tended her family's garden, and spent her days in prayer. Joan was a simple country girl, devoutly religious and full of kindness. That is, until one day when she heard a voice calling out to her. And then everything changed. You see, Joan wasn't any ordinary peasant. She was destined for greatness. Or perhaps it was destiny that chose Joan because she was just an ordinary girl. Whatever the case may be, Joan was about to play an extraordinary role in history. She would go on to lead armies into battle, rescue France from a brutal foreign invader, and eventually become a martyr for the French crown. Her story is one of bravery, faith, and the strange ways of fate. Joan of Arc is without a doubt one of the most iconic figures in all of medieval Europe. But to understand how Joan became a warrior, we need to step back and look at what was happening in France before she ever heard that fateful call. Because Joan's story was set in motion by a century of war. From 1337 to 1453, England and France fought each other in a brutal conflict known as the 100 Years' War. Now, the name is a bit misleading because even though it's called the 100 Years' War, it wasn't a continuous war for 100 years straight. Instead, it was a series of on and off again conflicts separated by periods of truce. But all told, the war did last for around 120 years, and during that time, England and France fought each other so many times that they basically got sick of it. The immediate cause of the war was a dispute over who had the right to rule France. See, back then, the King of England also considered himself the King of France. But when Charles IV died in 1328, he left no direct heirs. His brother Philip was next in line, but King Edward III of England felt he had a better claim to the throne. He invaded France to try to take the crown for himself, and the French nobles switched sides in droves to join him. For the first few decades of the war, it looked like England might win. They took the city of Calais and held on to it for 300 years. They also won some big battles against the French, but after that, things started to turn around. In 1429, a new French leader emerged on the scene, and his name was Charles VII. Charles was only 16 years old when the war began. He watched as his father, Charles VI, went crazy and gave away half of France to the English. Then he watched as the English captured the city of Orleans. But Charles didn't give up. He called for help and waited for the right moment to strike back. And that's when Joan of Arc entered the picture. Joan was born around 1412 in the village of Domremy. We don't know much about her early life, but we do know that she was very religious. Joan began hearing voices when she was 13. She thought they were coming from divine saints, and they told her that France was in danger and that she needed to do something about it. But Joan didn't want to listen to these voices. She was just a simple girl who wanted to live a simple life. But the voices kept coming back, telling her that she had to save France. And finally, she agreed. Joan took her concerns to the local priest, and he helped her convince her parents that she was really hearing the voices of saints. So Joan traveled to the nearby city of Vademouin to meet with the royal court. When Charles VII heard Joan's story, he decided to take a chance on her. He put her in charge of assembling an army to retake Orleans. This was a risky move. Joan had never led an army before, and she was just a simple peasant girl. But Charles had no other options, and he desperately needed someone to turn the tide of the war. Joan rallied the French troops around her, and together they marched on Orleans. The English had already begun to sack the city, but Joan's forces managed to drive them back. She led the French to victory in 4 major battles, and after that, everyone knew that the tide of the war had turned. Joan was hailed as a hero. She was given command of the entire French army and made a noble. In fact, she was so popular that the English tried to capture or kill her, but she managed to escape every trap they set for her. In 1430, however, Joan's luck ran out. She was captured by the Burgundians, a group of German mercenaries fighting for the English, and sold to the English for 10,000 francs. The English put her on trial for heresy, and she was found guilty and sentenced to death. She was burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431, at the age of 19. But even in death, Joan was a martyr for the French crown. Her execution inspired the French to keep fighting, and they eventually won the war. It was a long and bloody affair, but by the end of it, the English had lost all of their territory in France, and Joan was remembered as the hero who had saved France from the English. Now, this is a pretty epic story, but let's be real here. The real reason why the English lost the war was not because of a little peasant girl who heard voices. There were actually a lot of factors at play here. First of all, the 100 Years' War wasn't really a war between two evenly matched opponents. Sure, there were some times when the French were winning and some times when the English were winning, but overall, the English were the stronger power. They had a bigger economy, a bigger population, and a stronger military. So why did they lose? Well, the first reason is pretty obvious. The English were fighting a war on foreign soil. They were far away from home, and they had to transport all of their supplies across the channel. That's not easy to do, especially back then when there were no roads or bridges. They had to use boats. Also, the English were fighting against the French, and the French had a numerical advantage. For most of the war, the English were outnumbered, which means they had to fight smarter, not harder, and they did for a while. For example, at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the English longbowmen shot down thousands of French knights. But eventually, the English started to lose battles, and that was because they were fighting a defensive war. You see, when you're fighting a war on foreign soil, it's very easy to get bogged down in the logistics of it all. You have to worry about feeding your troops, housing them, supplying them with ammunition, and keeping them healthy. And if you can't do all those things, then your troops are gonna get tired and demoralized, and they not gonna fight as hard. And that's what happened to the English. They just couldn't keep up with the French in the long run. And that brings us to the third reason why the English lost the war: the French countryside. The French countryside was just not built for war. There were no roads or bridges, so the English had to use boats to transport their supplies. And that was risky because boats are unpredictable things. And to make matters worse, the English were fighting in a foreign country. They didn't speak the language, they didn't know the terrain, and they didn't know how to farm the land, so they couldn't grow food there. That meant they had to bring all their food with them, which made things even more difficult. And to add insult to injury, the French countryside was just not very welcoming to the English. The peasants hated the English invaders, and they would sabotage them at every opportunity. They would burn their crops, kill their livestock, and even poison their water. And that made things even harder for the English. They were fighting a war on multiple fronts, and they just didn't have the resources to win. In the end, the 100 Years' War was not just a battle between two armies. It was a battle between two countries, and France won because it was willing to fight harder and smarter than England. And while Joan of Arc didn't start the war, she certainly made an impact on its outcome. The war was a brutal one, and it lasted for over 100 years. During that time, the English and French fought each other so many times that they basically got sick of it. Throughout the Middle Ages, men died by the sword, soldiers clashed on battlefields from England to the Holy Land, and entire dynasties met their end with a kingly head rolling. Through it all, Death stalked mankind, and sometimes it wore a crown. But while many medieval deaths met their end in glorious combat or bloody revolution, others succumbed to a more subtle, creeping doom, and few were more terrifying than the Black Death, which carved its way into European history in the mid-14th century and consumed millions in its wake. In the summer of 1346, an immense fleet arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina. It was the first big trading voyage from Asia to reach Europe in several years, and on board were exotic silks and spices along with something far less fragrant, the Black Death. The plague had been ravaging Asia since at least the 1330s, and now it was here. It's not entirely clear how the disease arrived. The leading theory is that rodents aboard the ships carrying the sickness from Asia to Europe, specifically the Oriental rat flea, which normally infested cats in the Middle East, jumped ship to humans when they ran out of feline hosts. Whatever the case, it quickly found a home. Rats were everywhere, living among the people in crowded cities and sharing their beds in the night, and there they thrived. The Black Death itself was caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria. It's not entirely clear how the disease started, but once it arrived in Europe, it wasted little time spreading. Fleas would become infected after feeding on rodents, and when they moved to human hosts, they transmitted the illness. The result was bubonic plague, characterized by fever, chills, vomiting and agonizing swellings in the groin and armpits called buboes, which turned black and oozed foul matter. If untreated, the disease was almost always fatal. Victims usually died within a week of coming down with symptoms, and often were dead before anyone knew what hit them. Sometimes the Black Death manifested in another, even more horrifying form. The pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, causing violent coughing fits, bloody sputum, and the death of the host within days. Quickly, the city of Messina and the surrounding countryside were overwhelmed. Victims died so suddenly that the sick often didn't have time to confess their sins or receive last rites. The church, whose power was based in part on administering sacraments like extreme unction, was thrown into disarray. Within weeks, the plague had seeped out of the countryside around Messina and into the city itself, where it swiftly spread from house to house. Soon the whole of Italy was in peril. Entire villages were wiped out. Markets and businesses shuttered. With so many dying, there weren't enough priests to go round. Many areas were simply declared infected and sealed off. No one could come in or leave. But the quarantine never stopped the plague. Rather, it spread outward from the epicenter in southern Italy toward France and Spain. Along the way, it devastated the Italian peninsula. By 1348, it reached Florence, where Giovanni Boccaccio set the opening scene of his Decameron. A group of young Florentines flee the city to escape the plague, but the death toll is so high that soon they encountered no one in the streets. Houses are abandoned, shops are closed. The air is thick with the stench of death. Soon the rich and powerful were succumbing to the disease. King Edward III of England fell ill and died in 1350. So did his heir, the sickly Edward II, Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince, who perished before his father, possibly contracting the disease during a campaign in France. Add to this the already beleaguered Holy Roman Emperor, Charles IV, the head of the Western Schism, Pope Clement VI, and countless nobles, clergy and commoners, and it becomes clear that no one was safe. How many people died is still debated, with estimates ranging from 75 to 200 million worldwide. In Europe alone, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people perished. In some villages, there was not a single survivor. All told, the Black Death killed between 2/3 and 3/4 of the people in some places. With the population so drastically reduced, the social fabric of Europe was irreparably damaged. Families and communities broken by death. Estates were dissolved and fields lay untended. Great kingdoms were nearly brought to their knees. England as Edward III was too sick to effectively rule, and France teetered under the regency of Queen Isabella of France. Even the mighty Ottoman Empire felt the effects of the plague, suffering a staggering loss of life. Yet nowhere was more profoundly affected than Europe, whose political, religious and economic foundations were cracked by the sudden mass death. But amid such a terrible catastrophe, blame and scapegoating flourished. Superstitions ran rampant. Some blamed Christ himself for abandoning his flock. Others looked to the sky for answers. In 1345, a comet streaked across the heavens, lending credence to doomsday predictions and astrological fears. Still others pointed to heresy, and in these fearful times, no one was more vulnerable than the Jews, who were accused of poisoning wells and were subjected to horrific massacres throughout Europe. But no group bore the brunt of public ire more than the poor and marginalized. Often the victims were too poor to seek medical treatment, too sick to travel, or too isolated to get help. When they died, the bodies were piled up and burned, the smoke drifting across towns and villages, carrying with it the stench of death and suspicion. Those who survived often fell victim to prejudice and fear. In 1348, as the plague raged across France, the English began a brutal campaign against the French peasantry, accusing them of deliberately infecting English soldiers and civilians alike. They retaliated by killing messengers, burning crops, and generally making life miserable for the English, who responded by executing suspected French agents, fearful of contagion. The English also built barricades around their towns and villages, further isolating the populace. But the strategy backfired. Instead of protecting the English, the barriers trapped the disease inside. Towns like Oxford and Cambridge were overwhelmed. When survivors fled to the countryside, they carried the plague with them. There, the death toll was even greater. Peasants who had toiled for generations in the English fields were dying by the thousands. Sometimes in a single day, the countryside descended into chaos, and the English nobility, already stretched thin by the 100 Years' War, faced a manpower crisis. While the nobility and clergy suffered terribly, the lack of a centralized state apparatus meant that records of the Black Death were incomplete. For one thing, hardly anyone was around to collect data, and much of what was recorded was lost to the ravages of the plague itself. As such, the total death toll may never be known, nor will we ever know the full extent of the plague's impact on medieval Europe. Even as death gripped the continent, change was afoot. Labor was in short supply, and farmers couldn't afford to pay the rents demanded by absentee landlords. They took matters into their own hands, and in 1350, Jacquerie rebelled against the nobility. It was the largest peasant revolt in French history, led by the charismatic knight Jean the Fearless. Though brutally suppressed, it forced King John to negotiate terms with the rebels, granting them tax cuts and legal protections. While such reforms were ultimately temporary, the revolt showed that the social order was cracking under the strain of the plague. Feudalism, which had bound the peasantry to the land for centuries, began to fall apart. With fewer workers available, peasants could command higher wages. That meant that, for the first time in memory, they could think about leaving the land and becoming free laborers. It wasn't easy, and serfdom persisted for centuries, but the seeds of change were sown. Such developments were mirrored elsewhere. The Great Dying had consequences beyond the grave. As the Black Death continued its relentless march, it left a legacy that echoed through the ages. Entire professions were decimated. Labor shortages led to massive inflation. New diseases emerged, and long after the plague subsided, its echoes lingered. Stories of the horrors of the pestilence were passed down for generations. The plague was death incarnate, but it was also change. It carved scars so deep that they would define the course of Europe for generations to come. So when thinking about the worst plagues in history, remember the Black Death, which killed millions in the Middle Ages and changed the course of history forever. Today we will see how the Mongols conquered the world and killed 40 to 60 million people in the process. The Mongols were a nomadic people originally from the steppes of Central Asia. They were horsemen who lived in yurts, these portable dwellings that could be folded up and taken down when their owners moved locations. By the late 1100s, they had become a major power in Northeast Asia. It was at this time that the Mongols were led by a man named Genghis Khan. He united the various Mongol tribes and founded the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan was a brilliant military leader, and he used his skills to conquer much of Asia and Eastern Europe. Under his leadership, the Mongols developed new military tactics and weapons that allowed them to defeat larger and more powerful armies. They were especially skilled at using cavalry charges to break through enemy lines, and their archers were deadly day or night. The Mongol Empire was vast and diverse. It included people of many different cultures and religions. Despite this diversity, the Mongols were able to hold their empire together through a combination of military might, diplomacy, and religious tolerance. Genghis Khan was succeeded by his son, Ogedai Khan, and then by his grandson, Monkey Khan. It was under Monkey's reign that the Mongols reached the height of their power. They had control over much of Asia and Eastern Europe. The Mongol Empire would eventually be broken up into several smaller khanates, but the Golden Horde would continue to pose a threat to Europe for years to come. The Golden Horde was a Mongol Khanate that ruled over much of Eastern Europe and Russia during the 13th and 14th centuries. It was founded by Bachu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. After the invasion of Eastern Europe, the Golden Horde reached its peak under the rule of Osman Bey, who expanded its territory into the Black Sea region. However, The Golden Horde eventually declined due to internal conflicts and the rise of the Russian Principalities. Nonetheless, the Golden Horde left a lasting impact on Eastern Europe, both through its military conquests and its cultural exchanges. One of the most important aspects of the Golden Horde's legacy is its role in the Mongol invasions of Eastern Europe. Under the leadership of Bachu Khan and his successors, the Mongols launched devastating attacks into the heart of the continent, pillaging and burning cities along the way. These invasions resulted in the deaths of millions of people and had a profound impact on the political and social order of Europe. Despite the brutality of these conquests, the Golden Horde also facilitated cultural exchanges between East and West. As the Mongols spread across Eurasia, they encountered a variety of different cultures and religions, including Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. This exposure to other ways of life led to the exchange of ideas and goods between different regions, which in turn contributed to the development of new trade routes and intellectual movements. One notable example of this cultural exchange can be seen in the adoption of Persian administrative practices by the Golden Horde. As the Mongols integrated the conquered territories into their empire, they began to adopt local customs and institutions to better govern their subjects. This led to the introduction of Persian language and legal codes into the Mongol court, which in turn influenced the development of literature and scholarship in the region. Overall, the legacy of the Golden Horde is a complex and multifaceted one. While the Mongol invasions of Eastern Europe were undoubtedly brutal and devastating, the Golden Horde's role in promoting cultural exchange and introducing new ideas to the region should not be overlooked. Its impact on the political, social, and intellectual landscape of Eastern Europe was profound and far-reaching, and its influence can still be felt today. The Mongol army was made up of highly trained and disciplined soldiers who were experts in horseback riding and archery. Their tactics were often devastating, employing feigned retreats, surprise attacks, and lightning-fast cavalry charges to overwhelm their opponents. The Mongols were also known for their ability to adapt to different terrains and climates, allowing them to campaign successfully in both hot and cold environments. Despite their military prowess, the Mongols were not invincible. They faced defeats at the hands of the Song dynasty in China and the Kingdom of Hungary in Europe. However, these setbacks only fueled their determination to succeed, and ultimately they went on to conquer vast territories across Asia and Europe. The Mongols were a formidable fighting force. The Mongol army was composed of professional soldiers who were required to serve for at least 3 months out of the year. Soldiers were expected to provide their own armor and weapons. Although the government did provide some funding for their upkeep, soldiers were organized into units of 10, 100, and 1,000, with each unit led by a non-commissioned officer. The Mongol army was known for its use of psychological warfare, which involved intimidating and demoralizing the enemy before battle. They would often send threatening messages to their enemies, warning them of the devastation that awaited them if they did not surrender. Additionally, the Mongols employed torture and public executions to instill fear and discourage resistance. Once the Mongols laid siege to a city, they would typically surround it with a large force of cavalry and infantry. They would then proceed to cut off all food and water supplies to the city, hoping that the inhabitants would surrender due to starvation or disease. If the Mongols decided not to lay siege to a city, they would instead bypass it and move on to the next target, burning the city on their way out. The Mongols' main weapon of war was their horses. They were expert horsemen, and their cavalry charges were devastating. They also used bows and arrows extensively, and their archers were incredibly accurate. They also used a variety of other weapons, including swords, spears, and battle axes. But their most feared weapon was probably their catapults. They used catapults to hurl large stones and other objects over the walls of cities and castles. This was a very effective way to break through defenses and cause massive damage. Now let's talk about their strategy. The Mongols were known for their use of feigned retreats, which involved pretending to flee from battle in order to lure the enemy into a trap. They would typically retreat to a prepared ambush position, where they would then attack the pursuing enemy and annihilate them. Another key element of Mongol strategy was their use of light and fast cavalry units to harass and disrupt the enemy's supply and communication lines. This made it difficult for the enemy to mount a sustained defense and contributed to their eventual defeat. Mongols were also known for their willingness to use dirty tactics such as poisoning wells and using biological weapons. They would often infect wells with disease-ridden corpses and then wait for the enemy troops to drink the water and become sick. Despite their military success, the Mongols were not without their enemies. In fact, They faced opposition from a variety of different groups throughout their conquests. One of the most notable examples of Mongol resistance can be seen in the city of Baghdad, Iraq. The Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, refused to surrender his city to the Mongols and instead fought back against the invaders. Although the Mongols eventually won the battle and sacked the city, al-Mustasim's resistance was seen as a heroic last stand against the ruthless conquerors. Another example of resistance to the Mongols can be seen in the Kingdom of Hungary in Eastern Europe. The Hungarian king, Andrew III, led his forces to battle against the Mongols at the Battle of the Karansebes. Although the Mongols won the battle and inflicted heavy casualties on the Hungarians, Andrew III's resistance prevented the Mongols from advancing further into Europe. The Mongol Empire was vast and its size posed significant challenges for administration and governance. As the empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, the vast distance made it difficult for central authorities to maintain control over distant provinces. Consequently, the Mongol rulers adopted a decentralized approach to governance, granting a great deal of autonomy to local officials. This allowed for greater flexibility and responsiveness to the needs of each region, but it also created opportunities for corruption and abuse of power. Furthermore, the diversity of cultures and languages within the Mongol Empire presented another administrative challenge. While the Mongols were tolerant of different cultures, they did not have a system in place to effectively manage the complexities of governing such a diverse population. This led to misunderstandings and conflicts between different ethnic groups, which sometimes erupted into violence and instability. Moreover, the lack of a unified legal code or system of justice also contributed to the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire. Each province was able to develop its own laws and customs, which often led to conflicting rulings and a sense of disunity among the populace. The absence of a centralized legal system made it difficult to ensure fairness and equality under the law, which ultimately undermined the stability of the empire. In conclusion, while the Mongol Empire achieved great success in uniting vast territories under its rule, its size and diversity also presented significant administrative challenges. The decentralization of power, cultural diversity, and lack of a uniform legal system contributed to the fragmentation and eventual decline of the Mongol Empire. Nevertheless, the Mongol legacy continues to be felt today, and their impact on history is undeniable. Holy Wars, Unholy Numbers, a story about courage and cowardice, piety and greed, faith and fanaticism. It's about the Crusades, a series of religious expeditions sanctioned by the Latin Church in the medieval period, with the goal of reclaiming the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Between 1096 and 1291, 8 major crusades were launched into the Levant, an area comprising modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. The first 4 crusades saw significant Christian success. They seized large territories, established crusader states, and captured the key holy sites. However, as the century wore on, Muslim forces pushed back against the European invaders and eventually recaptured all of the lost territory. While the Crusades failed in their overall objective, they left a lasting impact on both Europe and the Middle East, influencing politics, religion, culture, and trade for centuries to come. But let's start with the most infamous moment in the history of the Crusades, the sack of Jerusalem. On July 1099, European soldiers, many of them French, German and Italian peasants armed with little more than pitchforks and clubs, stormed the city. In the ensuing chaos, thousands of Muslims, Jews, and even fellow Eastern Christians who had lived there for centuries were massacred. Chronicler Fulcher of Chartres wrote, "No mercy was shown, not to age or sex or condition, to plunder, to kill, to wound, to torture, to burn, to rob, and to commit every kind of wickedness. They ran after each other through the streets and alleys, hewing people to pieces and dispatching them in 1,000 different ways." Fulcher claimed that over 40,000 people were killed, but those figures should be treated with skepticism given the wildly inaccurate and often exaggerated accounts of medieval chroniclers. The storming of Jerusalem came at the end of the First Crusade, a sprawling, disorganized campaign that began in 1095 after Pope Urban II called for volunteers to seize Jerusalem from Muslim rulers. As the First Crusade got underway, word spread across Europe and volunteers by the thousands, mostly poor landless men, headed east. By the end, there may have been as many as 60,000 European soldiers in the Levant, though estimates vary widely. Reaching the Holy Land was no easy feat, and along the way, the Crusaders seized cities like Antioch and Jerusalem. battling armies of the Seljuk Turks and the Muslim lords of northern Syria. The First Crusade ended in 1099 with the capture of Jerusalem, but the newly established Crusader kingdom soon found itself fighting for survival against determined Muslim opponents. Pope Urban II granted the Kingdom of Jerusalem sovereignty over the coastal region, stretching from the Sea of Galilee to the Egyptian border, as well as inland to the River Jordan and the city of Damascus. Although geographically compact, the kingdom contained diverse regions. In the south, rolling hills and plains yielded to the rugged mountains of the interior and the arid Syrian desert to the east. Despite these challenges, ambitious Crusader leaders sought to expand their realm, leading to conflicts with neighboring Muslim states. These early rulers also faced the challenge of governing a kingdom where the vast majority of the population was non-Christian. The Crusaders were a tiny minority, numbering no more than 2 to 4% of the total population, with most of the subjects being native Muslims and Jews. The establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1099 was a watershed moment in medieval European history. For centuries, the idea of a Christian state in a Holy Land had been a dream deferred. Now it was a reality. This achievement would inspire many Europeans to participate in subsequent crusades, but it would also pose unique challenges. The Crusaders quickly found themselves at war with neighboring Muslim powers, including the Zengid dynasty of northern Syria. Tensions escalated, leading to the Battle of the Horns of Hattin in 1187, a decisive Muslim victory that resulted in the capture of Jerusalem by Saladin, the legendary Muslim leader. This defeat prompted the launch of the Third Crusade, which included some of the most famous medieval warriors: Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Despite their prowess, the Crusaders were unable to recapture Jerusalem. Instead, a truce was negotiated granting limited access to the city for pilgrims. After the setback of the Third Crusade, European leaders recognized the need for a more organized approach to holding the Holy Land. In 1188, Pope Gregory VIII called for the Fourth Crusade. Although it initially aimed to capture Jerusalem, political and financial considerations led to its diversion to Egypt. This marked a turning point in the Crusades. The focus shifted from religious zeal to strategic and economic interests, a trend that would continue in subsequent expeditions. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Jerusalem continued to face challenges. Internal divisions, weak leadership, and the threat of external enemies took a heavy toll. By the late 12th century, the kingdom was on the brink of collapse. The arrival of the Mongols in the Middle East further destabilized the region, posing a grave threat to the Crusader states. The Mongol onslaught overwhelmed Jerusalem, forcing King Henry II to flee to the island fortress of Acre in 1218. With the Mongols advancing, European leaders convened the Fifth Crusade in 1217. Despite initial successes, the crusade ultimately failed to achieve its goals. By 1229, the Crusaders had seized Jerusalem once again, but this victory proved short-lived. Political maneuvering led to a quick withdrawal, and the city was lost once more in 1244. As the Crusades progressed, their nature evolved. Early expeditions were largely spontaneous responses to papal appeals, driven by religious fervor. Later crusades became more structured affairs, planned and funded by European royalty. The Sixth Crusade in 1228-29 was notable for its diplomatic conclusion, securing 6 months of truce with Sultan al-Kamil in exchange for an annual tribute, marking an early instance of peaceful coexistence in the region. Throughout the Crusades, European involvement in a Holy Land was not limited to military campaigns. The establishment of trading posts and the flow of wealth generated through trade networks had a significant impact on medieval European economies. Moreover, contact with the cultures of the Middle East introduced Europeans to new ideas and goods. For example, Venetian merchants returning from the East often carried with them spices, silks, and ceramics that added to their fortunes and exposed Europeans to exotic products from distant lands. By the late 13th century, the balance of power in the Levant had decisively shifted in favor of the Mamluk dynasty of Egypt. Facing the growing strength of the Mamluk Sultanate, European leaders convened the Seventh Crusade in 1248, led by King Louis IX of France. Despite initial victories, the crusade ultimately met with defeat and Louis was captured by the Mamluks, while his brother, King Blanche of France, negotiated his release. The Seventh Crusade suffered a severe setback. The Eighth Crusade in 1270 was the final major effort to recapture Jerusalem, led once again by King Louis IX. The expedition aimed to conquer Tunis in North Africa. However, The crusade ended in disaster when Louis contracted malaria and died, leading to the expedition's abandonment. The Crusades were a complex web of religious zeal, political ambition, and economic interest. They had profound effects on both Europe and the Middle East, reshaping the religious, cultural, and political landscapes of the regions. The legacy of the Crusades continues to be debated and discussed, serving as a reminder of the complexities of history and the multifaceted nature of human endeavors. Over the course of the Crusades, an estimated 1 to 3 million people lost their lives. Around 500,000 European Christians are believed to have perished in the fighting, while hundreds of thousands more are estimated to have died in the siege of Jerusalem alone. The Crusades also saw widespread destruction, particularly of holy sites and cultural treasures. The burning of the Great Library of Antioch in 1154, which housed thousands of ancient manuscripts and texts, was a devastating loss for scholarship during the medieval period. Despite the immense loss of life and destruction, the Crusades also led to cultural exchanges and the spread of knowledge between Europe and the Middle East. European scholars and merchants gained access to classical texts and scientific works from the Islamic world. Similarly, Muslim scholars studied Latin texts that had been translated into Arabic. The Crusades also spurred the growth of trade networks, as European merchants sought to access the valuable goods of the Middle East. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew wealthy through trade in spices, textiles, and other commodities. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Crusades is their legacy in art, literature, and popular culture. Tales of brave knights, fierce battles, and mythical relics like the Holy Grail captured the imaginations of medieval audiences. Works like the Song of Roland and stories of the Knights Templar continue to fascinate readers today. In essence, the Crusades represent a pivotal and controversial period in history. They shaped the course of medieval Europe and the Middle East, leaving an indelible mark on the religious, cultural, and political landscapes of the regions. The Crusades serve as a reminder of the complexities of human history and the multifaceted nature of our interactions with the past. Studying the Crusades allows us to gain a deeper understanding of the medieval world and the forces that shaped it. It encourages us to examine the interplay of religion, politics, economics, and culture, and to consider the lasting impact of these events on the world we live in today. And for more on the era of chivalry, courage, and castles, stay tuned for more content. The Mongols were one of the deadliest groups in the history of humanity. During their rise to power, they performed some of the most horrific acts of violence, resulting in the deaths of tens of millions of people. As the Mongol Empire grew, so did their appetite for battle and bloodshed. The vast, sprawling empire eventually stretched from the Pacific Ocean all the way to Eastern Europe, a feat which had never been accomplished before. But with such an enormous empire came an even more enormous amount of people who were affected by the Mongols. For some, the Mongols were liberators who freed them from tyranny. But for many others, the Mongols were agents of death and destruction who slaughtered anyone who stood in their way. If the Middle Ages had a face of death, it was the face of the Mongols. In the 13th century, under the banner of Genghis Khan, a nomadic people from the steppes of Mongolia unleashed a storm of conquest the world had never seen before. Their armies moved like shadows across the land, swift, disciplined, and utterly merciless. When the Mongols descended upon a city, the result was often the same: fire, blood, and silence. Towns that resisted were wiped from existence. Populations were slaughtered or enslaved. The devastation was so absolute that survivors told tales of entire rivers running red with blood. One of the most infamous massacres came in 1221, when the city of Nishapur in Persia fell. After the death of Genghis Khan's son-in-law, the Mongols sought vengeance. It is said that nearly the entire population, more than 150,000 people, was executed. The streets became graveyards, and the once great city was reduced to ash. And yet this was only a fraction of the death they brought. Across Asia and into Europe, the Mongols left a trail of destruction that historians estimate claimed 40 to 60 million lives. Entire kingdoms fell, dynasties crumbled, and ancient cities vanished beneath their wrath. But the Mongols were not merely killers, they were conquerors with a purpose. Their empire stretched from China to Eastern Europe, connecting East and West in a way the world had never known. They spread terror, yes, but also trade, culture, and technology along the Silk Road. To the medieval mind, however, they were not men at all. They were a scourge sent by God, the very horsemen of the apocalypse made flesh. And for those who faced their armies, survival was not a likelihood, it was a miracle. Genghis Khan is one of the most feared leaders in human history. a title he shares with other powerful conquerors such as Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte. During his lifetime, he united the tribes of the Mongolian steppe into one powerful force and went on to build the largest contiguous land empire in history. His Mongol armies killed millions of people across Asia and Eastern Europe. But what was it about these nomadic horsemen that inspired such fear? What made them so effective in battle, and why did they slaughter so many people? This is the story of the Mongols, the deadliest group in history. There are few places on earth as harsh and unforgiving as the Mongolian steppe. The landscape is characterized by endless plains, extreme temperatures, and a scarcity of resources. This makes it an inhospitable place to live, but it also makes it a great place to raise horses. Horses are the lifeblood of the Mongols. They provide them with a means of transportation, a source of food, and a weapon of war. The Mongol Empire would not have been possible without the horse. The Mongols are a nomadic people who travel from place to place with their herds of animals. They live in yurts, which are portable dwellings that can be easily packed up and moved. Mongol society is highly mobile, and this mobility allows them to adapt to the changing seasons and to take advantage of new opportunities. The Mongols are also a highly egalitarian society. There is no formal social hierarchy, and all members of the community are considered equal. This egalitarianism extends even to women, who enjoy a great deal of freedom and autonomy. Women can own property, participate in trade, and even divorce their husbands. Mongol women also fought alongside men in battle. In order to survive on the harsh Mongolian steppe, the Mongols must be self-sufficient and resourceful. They rely on their herds of animals for food, clothing, and shelter, and they are skilled hunters and gatherers. Mongols are also expert horsemen and archers. From the time they are very young, Mongol children are trained in the art of horsemanship and archery. This makes them formidable fighters, and it also gives them a significant advantage in warfare. The Mongols are a highly martial society. Warfare is a fact of life, and every Mongol is expected to be able to defend himself or herself in combat. Mongol armies are composed of highly skilled and disciplined fighters. They are experts in the use of bows and arrows, and they are also very familiar with hand-to-hand combat. The Mongols are also very innovative in their use of military tactics. They are known for their use of psychological warfare, as well as their ability to adapt to different situations. All of these factors combined make the Mongols a very dangerous enemy. When Genghis Khan took power in the early 1200s, he set out to unite the various Mongol tribes under his banner. He was successful in doing so, and he went on to create the largest land empire in history. Under Genghis Khan's leadership, the Mongols were able to conquer vast amounts of territory. They were able to do this because of the Mongols' skills as horsemen and archers, their egalitarian society, and their martial culture. Genghis Khan was a brilliant military strategist, and he was able to use his knowledge to great effect on the battlefield. He was also a master of logistics, and he was able to keep his armies supplied with the resources they needed to fight. As a result of these factors, the Mongols were able to conquer vast amounts of territory very quickly. One of the key factors in the Mongols' success was their use of psychological warfare. The Mongols would often terrorize their enemies before a battle even took place. They would send messages to the leaders of the cities they were about to attack, threatening them with torture and death if they did not surrender. The Mongols were known for their brutality and their willingness to use torture on their enemies. This often caused the cities to surrender without a fight. When the Mongols did engage in battle, they were often victorious. Their skill in archery and horsemanship gave them a significant advantage over their enemies. The Mongols were also very innovative in their use of tactics. They would often use feints and decoys to trick their enemies. They were also very familiar with the terrain of the areas they were fighting in, which gave them another advantage. The Mongol Empire reached its greatest extent under the rule of Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan. At its greatest, the empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. The Mongol Empire was a vast and diverse one. It included a wide variety of cultures and peoples. Despite this diversity, the Mongols were able to maintain control over their empire through their efficient use of the military and their ability to adapt to different cultures. The Mongol military was highly efficient. It was composed of highly skilled and disciplined fighters who were experts in the use of bows and arrows. The Mongols also used a variety of siege weapons to capture cities. In addition to their military strength, the Mongols were also able to adapt to different cultures. They were able to do this because of their egalitarian society. The Mongols were able to integrate people of different cultures into their army and government. This helped them to maintain control over their vast empire. But the success of the Mongols did not last forever. In the 1300s, the empire began to decline. One of the reasons for the decline was the death of Kublai Khan. Under his successors, the empire became increasingly fragmented. In addition, the Mongols were unable to adapt to the changes that were taking place in the world. As new technologies developed, the Mongols were slow to adopt them. This made them less competitive and ultimately led to the decline of their empire. The Mongols were a fascinating and complex people. They were a nomadic tribe that lived on the harsh Mongolian steppe. They were able to conquer vast amounts of territory through their skills as horsemen and archers, their egalitarian society, and their martial culture. Although their empire eventually declined, the Mongols left a lasting legacy on the world. They were one of the most feared and ruthless groups in history, but they were also one of the most successful. It's easy to think of warfare in the Middle Ages as a low-intensity affair, something akin to glorified skirmishes where knights joust while everyone else plays tiddlywinks. However, there was another side to this coin, one that involved massive, bloody battles that were as brutal as they were awe-inspiring. And when it comes to encapsulating the true nature of medieval warfare, few moments stand out quite like the Battle of Hastings in the year 1066. In the year 1066, the fate of England was decided in a single, brutal clash, one that would forever change the course of medieval Europe. On one side stood Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, fresh from repelling a Viking invasion in the north. On the other, William, Duke of Normandy, a man determined to seize the English throne he believed was promised to him. Their armies converged on the rolling hills near Hastings, and what followed was nothing short of a bloodbath. As dawn broke, the English shield wall stood firm, row after row of warriors locked together, racing for the Norman onslaught. For hours, wave after wave of cavalry and infantry smashed against the wall, only to be hurled back by the unyielding Saxons. The ground was soaked in blood, and bodies piled high as each side refused to yield. But then, cunning turned the tide. The Normans feigned retreat, luring the English from their defensive line. The final blow came with the death of Harold himself struck down. Legend says, by an arrow to the eye. With their king fallen, the English resistance collapsed. By nightfall, thousands of warriors lay dead, their bodies scattered across the fields of Hastings. The death toll was staggering. Some accounts speak of 6,000 to 7,000 men slain in a single day, a number almost unimaginable for the time. The conquest was complete. William became William the Conqueror, and Anglo-Saxon England was no more. So join us as we turn back the clock and explore one of the bloodiest chapters in medieval warfare, the Battle of Hastings. Why? Because when it comes to battles, some are bigger than others, and this one changed England forever. On the one side stood Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. He went from being the Earl of Wessex, essentially the regional governor of an area that today would be known as the southwest of England, to becoming the most powerful man in England within a few years. Yes, you heard me right. We're talking about the daddy issues and historical figures, but with a twist. King Edward the Confessor, childless and perhaps feeling a bit insecure, appointed Godwine as Earl of Wessex in 1034, giving him the role typically reserved for the next in line to the throne. Well, kingship in England at the time was like owning the coolest car in the neighborhood. Everyone wanted it, including Godwinson. Once he even got into a massive brawl with Prince Aethelstan at a royal festival. That's right, a medieval bar fight. Who had a black eye the next day? You guessed it, the prince. Everyone assumed his son, the aforementioned Aethelstan, would take the throne. But guess what? Godwinson had other ideas. After a swift coronation of Aethelstan, Godwinson marched on London with his army, forcing the young king to flee to Normandy. Not cool, dude. So now Harold, thanks to his strategic marriages, which gave him a ton of clout among the English nobility. But let's be real, this was a temporary arrangement. England was a powder keg waiting to explode, and Godwinson knew it. Then along comes William, Duke of Normandy. Enter William, Duke of Normandy, also known as William the Bastard, because history loves creative nicknames. Unlike Harold, William's claim to the English throne was a bit more legitimate. See, Edward the Confessor before he breathed his last, supposedly named William as his successor. Nobody really knows. What we do know is that William had a serious case of junioritis. Just because William was named the heir apparent doesn't mean he didn't have to work for it. To secure his position, William made an official claim to the throne, expecting little resistance. But he was wrong. Dead wrong. When Edward died, Harold seized the opportunity and got crowned king instead. Talk about a plot twist. William was furious. He felt he was being robbed of what was rightfully his. But Harold was already in power and consolidating it. He defeated an invading force led by one of William's brothers and secured his hold on the throne. And here's the kicker. He was busy dealing with yet another Viking invasion in the north. William saw his chance and jumped at it. He assembled an army, set sail across the channel and landed in southern England, ready to teach Harold a lesson in humility. As the Norman army advanced, Harold was forced to abandon his campaign against the Vikings and march south to confront William. The result was a clash of titans. The Battle of Hastings began on October 14, 1066, near the town of Hastings in southeast England. The location wasn't just a random pick. It was on Senlac Hill, a strategic high ground that gave the defenders a natural advantage. The English army was drawn up in battle formation atop the hill, forming a shield wall, a tight, closely packed array of soldiers, with their shields interlocked to form a massive, nearly impenetrable barrier. They were like medieval body armor, but instead of individual pieces, it was a continuous wall of wood and iron. This defensive formation was the Anglo-Saxon answer to warfare at the time. But the Normans were about to show them a thing or two about adaptability. The Norman forces consisted of cavalry, infantry and archers, giving them a flexible edge on the battlefield. The battle raged for hours. The English held firm, repelling the initial Norman assaults. But as the day wore on, the Normans kept coming, wave after wave, each more determined than the last. There was no quarter given, no mercy shown. It was every man for himself in the thick of the fight. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the casualties mounted on both sides. But just as it seemed the English might hold out a bit longer, a rumor spread through the ranks. Harold had been killed. Now, whether this story is true or just a later embellishment, it doesn't really matter. The English shield wall, already weakened by hours of fighting, faltered. What followed was a rout. The English ranks broke and fled. Swords clashed, armor clanged, and men fell, not just from wounds, but from panic. It was a scene of utter pandemonium. When Harold's death was announced, his standard, a white dragon on a blue field, was taken down and trampled underfoot by the victors. It was a symbolic end to Saxon England. William had claimed the prize he believed was his. But what really happened at Hastings? Was it just a battle between two ambitious rulers, or something more significant? The Battle of Hastings was much more than a mere clash of arms. With Harold gone and his dynasty extinguished, the door to England's highest office was wide open. William wasted no time in walking through it. He was crowned king on Christmas Day 1066 at Westminster Abbey, marking the official beginning of the Norman conquest of England. Over the next few decades, the Normans imposed their language, their customs and their rule across the island. Anglo-Saxon English became a thing of the past, replaced by a new dialect influenced heavily by French. The old order was gone, replaced by a new nobility loyal to William and his successors. But why does this battle still matter today? It's seen as a pivotal moment in English history, the birth of a new era. But its importance goes beyond England's borders. It was a demonstration of how a smaller, more adaptable force could triumph over a larger, more entrenched one. It also reflects a broader trend in medieval warfare, the increasing professionalization of armies. The Normans, with their mix of cavalry and infantry, represented a more sophisticated approach to war than the mostly infantry-based Anglo-Saxons.